the spirits of Winona. I look at those buildings, you know, and I remember when I was young. I remember when I was a kid, and the feelings generated by the buildings and the people of yesterday. I think about the people who walked those streets in 1900, or who walked those streets in 1856, or 57, or 58, or 70. They had all the same problems kind of we did. They didn't always agree. They didn't always disagree. But they found a way. They found a way to get through their problems. So tonight I want to talk about walking down 3rd Street mostly. My stories center around the people who were here in the 1850s to the 1900s. So much of that time has been plowed over. Progress has rendered those buildings useless. But if you still look, you can find the wisdom that our forefathers left. So I wrote this piece this morning, actually. I had been working on it for a couple days. And sometimes I use another character to tell the story of Winona. This story is told by a guy named Stoner Thompson. And you can well imagine what Stoner was all about. But Stoner was a townie. Stoner grew up in this town. He walked the streets of this town. He made mistakes like we all do. He did good things. He did bad things. He lived the life of a townie. In this story, he happens to have a job at the Winona State Radio Station. This is Stoner Thompson reporting from the gymnasium of Old Phelps Hall, the beautiful campus of Winona State. It's been a beautiful summer so far, and so I got out walking. Now that school's out, the town breathes deeper. I walk through the old parts of campus and remember what was and what is, and think of white-haired old maids teaching in the grade school called Phelps that was once the heart of campus. I take a stroll through the big old houses of the neighborhood and start remembering my early thoughts as I re-walk my youthful memories. Walking through the neighborhood, I heard old voices and long-ago tales of how money grew. Little old ladies on porches impairing their wisdom on a young mind absorbing time talking. I crossed busy old Broadway, missing the elms which used to shadow the old street. People drive too fast on the street which oozes history, its missteps and its glory, just wanting to tell a story. I asked an old friend Lon about Lena Weinberg, and I took my seat in blooming grounds. The old cop didn't know anything about it. It was a long time ago, and cops didn't go nosing around the lands of the deep pockets back in the day. I asked about that Dodge Chrysler building where the original gas company was located, and whose gas mangled McWilliams' face in the old days of the Huff Hotel. He shook his head and talked of persistent rumors of Quick Trip setting up shop. Winona money moves quiet, always has, always will. We got a guy in town, we call him Secret Agent Man, always hanging around the fringes. He dropped a little plastic cylinder while talking to us. We wondered what was the meaning of the clue he left us. Winona has always had different ways of talking. I finished my drink and said goodbye to Lon. Now Lon, it's real. Lon Keith has been in these parts for 40, 50, 60 years. And he was an old cop and a retired cop. But he's still got a story to tell. He's still got a story that he wants people to learn, to know. And you can agree or disagree with him. And trust me, Lon Keith and I disagree about most everything. But I listen to Lon. I hear what Lon says. I hear what Lon talks about. And I hear Lon talk about the myths of his growing up and the myths of where he came from. Winona is a special town. And I was out walking on 3rd Street, down there by the Cupid. I don't know how many of you remember the Cupid Cafe from back in the day. where my parents met. It wasn't as high knob as Roos or some of the other restaurants in town. A couple low grades hung there. Well, more low grades than anything else. But everybody's got a home. And I remember as a kid, the buses pulling up Mr. Rivers depot in the back. It's where I got my twins tickets. That's where Mom and Dad met. It was where I got my start. Literally got my start at the QP Cafe. So anyway, I ran into the president of the German-American bank called John Ludwig. And John Ludwig was not only president of the German-American bank, John owned the Ludwig Hotel, which is where Peter's Beer Gardens was now. Beautiful 3-story brick hotel that fell into decay and came down before St. Clair's and the fire and all that kind of stuff. They had lopped off some of it. Mr. Ludwig was also involved in the transfer of the Huff Hotel to the Winona Hotel Corp., which he was part of, and that bought the Huff Hotel. There were a lot of outside interests working through Winona, and Lena Weinberg kind of got squished in the end. Although she might have done that to herself, but people had dreams. I sold them money to capture those dreams. You miss a payment, Verrazano and I would foreclose. Sometimes we just take over the business. We might let the guy run it, or we might find another guy. I was a Catholic, of course, and forgiveness is a basic tenet of Catholicism. This just gets in the way. I worried that the gates of hell awaited me, especially since Verrazano Simpson was my good friend. We were walking down 3rd past Nate & Alley's ice cream shop, which was J&K Office Products, and coast to coast in my days. Way back, it was Beck's Grocery and Mercantile. I knew Mr. Beck well. He did his banking at the German-American Bank. He had a darkness to him. Gloom filled his bones. Not a happy man, but a second-to-none businessman. It's a nice building today, but I remember walking in that building way back when and feeling a negative energy. He went through 3 or 4 wives. Kind of mysterious disappearing, if you ask me. I met so many people as I walked with John. He was a 4-time mayor and long-time councilman. I didn't ask about his share of the take because John, I read, had a bit of a short fuse in his day. And he used his walking cane a few times on folks who got in his way. Makes me wonder what wasn't put in the paper. Now, Verrazano wanted Lena's share of the Huff Hotel. Lena owned 10% of the Huff Hotel after McWilliams died. Those two, Lena and Verrazano, they weren't dancing partners. I think they both would have felt better if the other was dead. Verrazano would fight for a penny and didn't care who he took down. The rest of the Simpsons were nice people. But with Verrazano, you learned not to turn your back. We had reached second, and as John scanned the streets, he turned white, sat down on the bench kitty corner from the acoustic cafe, and covered his face staring at the ground. Now, the Simpson Bank is still standing. The Simpson Bank is where Claire Louise is now. It's got those steps going up that a hazard for people for a long time. But if you look at 2nd Street now, what's really cool, is after they took down all the houses of ill repute back in the 40s, a couple soldiers got clapped over there at Fort McCoy, and Governor Stanton said, enough is enough. 2nd Street went dead. It absolutely lost its identity. 30, 40 years, there was nothing happening on 2nd Street, unless they were doing something illegal, John, behind the scenes, but it was a quiet block. And you walk up and down that block now, There's the acoustic. There's a clothes shop. There's a seed shop. There's this Claire Louise. It's the Winona Post. There's something happening there that hasn't been happening for a long time. Winona is coming alive. There's some juice in that old lady's bones down there. And it's really nice to see. Just to go out for a walk up and down the street, you see people from all over. You look at those old buildings. You look at those old buildings and you think, what is happening in there? 60 years ago, what kind of dreams was that business owner? What kind of dreams did he have going through his head? It was a hope, and that lumber money coming from Winona just filtered through this economy. And it stayed that way for a long time till they started moving everything out to Seattle. And you know where they got that funding? They bought Frederick Weyerhaeuser and Laird Norton and a couple of the old Eastern lumber interests. They bought millions of acres of land from James J. Hill. Millions of acres. Hill was granted to the federal government, given to by the federal government. And they bought it. I mean, they bought it for like $11 million, which, if you think about it, back in the early 1900s, that was a good chunk of money. I mean, that was a lot of money. Mr. Hill paid for that mansion not only with railroad money, he did pretty well in the land business too. And I was going to tell a story about Laird Norton tonight, because I don't care how much money you got, nobody deserves to go through the tragedies that family did. They kept losing people left and right. But because there were two brothers and a cousin who kind of ran that company, their history is a little more complicated, and I want to get it right. So I'm just planting the seed, because some night you're going to come, and I'm going to tell you the story of Laird Norton, but not tonight. Now, there were two cheap bars in Winona. Well, there were a lot of cheap bars, right? The Mississippi House, which was down where they're building that new motel on the other side of the tracks by the movie theaters. That was really cheap. That was rock good, because the hobos would come there. They'd work for Old Man Latch, and then they'd take their daily check, and they'd come into the Mississippi House, and they'd drink it. And if they had enough money, they'd get a room upstairs. But most of them ended up back in the hobo jungle for another night. And you wake up early when you're sleeping in the hobo jungle, because that sun comes up by that river. I don't know if any of you ever woke up on a sandbar out there. Well, you usually don't sleep at 10 o'clock in those sandbars. You're up so they'd get up and they'd come wandering into town, and they'd hope they'd get a bowl of soup, maybe stop down at Walt Newman's place or something like that. Walt was a most kind, generous man. And then there was Kopoleski Saloon on the corner of 3rd and High Forest, where cars on their last legs are sold nowadays. Kopoleski Saloon was a tough spot. Now, there was always an enticement to kind of go into Kopoleski Saloon, because any of you who've been from Winona know that Kopoleski women are the prettiest around. I tell you, they knock your socks off like yesterday and today. I mean, these are salt of the earth people. The Koboleskis are all still over these parts. They're all over these parts. So I met this guy. I'm terrible with names. So he called himself the Mad Hatter, and I can remember. Oh, Tony. Oh, I forgot. Tony the Mad Hatter. Sometimes I'm getting better at it, you know. One thing I'm getting better at in life is forgetting. I'm getting really, really good. You know, it's the damnedest thing sometimes. I wave it up at the camera because they're live feeding us. And anyway, he started talking to me because John had his head bent, knocked down like this, and he wasn't saying nothing. It'll take Ludwig a while before he regains his senses. He's been knocked down before, you know. I live down there in the corner of 2nd and Mankato. I spend most of my time down there drinking at Kopleski's Saloon. Every once in a while, me and the boys would head downtown and see if we could find some Germans to pound on. They had spent generations oppressing us back in the old country. They were the government and had all the money and the military in their back pocket. We were just problems for the powers that were. We came down to pay back the favor, exact some revenge now that the field was a bit more level. The United States of America is a great place. The Germans, Russians, and the Prussians stole our freedom in old Poland. So we fought for our forefathers now that we were on equal footing. We'd go walking into that Lichtensteiner boarding house, brothel, and saloon on 2nd. And it wouldn't be 10 minutes and the group of us would be out in 2nd Street fighting and punching while having the time of our lives. John Ludwig wasn't afraid to have a go of it. I was a Teskey and we lived down near the river. Had to scrap to get by and sometimes a good fight cleared my senses. I never amounted to much. Folks called me the Mad Hatter. 2nd Street was the greatest street in the entire country. Bakers, lorries, whores, and businessmen, drunks, and riverboat gamblers. The street was the greatest in town. That's what Ludwig is mourning. The loss of his best times. Yeah, I respected Lena. You get to know everybody you know, and she might have been the only German I respected in all my years of living. She seemed to treat us all with respect. I looked over and Ludwig was coming to and looked like he wanted to say something. Anna and I used to come down to the Lichtensteiner bar every Friday. Frank had the best sausages, potatoes, and sauerkraut. Reminded me of my grandmother's cooking. And his beer? Well, what German doesn't like beer? When I first came here in 1868, there were more bars than churches. None of them were too fancy. Even the Huff Hotel had an edge to it. Winona was a tough town when the padded wheelers stopped, and people started seeing the freedom that living west of the Mississippi brought. I had enough money from the old country to build a 3-story motel where Peter's Beer Garden now sits. In the lower level, I had a fine restaurant which was known for its fine oysters, quality meat, and bottled beer. Made a small fortune and later became president of the German-American Bank. We would gather on Fridays and sing old German songs at the Lichtensteiner. Some of the men and women would dance, and the potatoes and sausages were second to none, and your worries would be forgotten. It was where I first met Lena. She looked at me skeptical, knowing full well Verrazano and I had relations through the bank. But what was most important was Anna feeling like she was home, back in Chicago with family and friends. She liked the hustle and bustle of a big city. Winters could be hard on folks, and Anna was always cold no matter how many logs I put on the fire or how many blankets I covered her with. When I would mention going to Frank's, she would beat me to the carriage and her face lit up like a modern-day Christmas tree. The ladies of the Lichtensteiner bar would get the whole place hopping and remembering where we came from. It's hard, Hanson, seeing the good times get forgotten. The buildings and the places of gathering were what made Winona roll. You got to meet people dirt poor and incredibly wealthy, all on a street not far from the river. It was the American dream.
Ready?
Are you?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it. All right. I was laughing, and every time I laughed, I blew a thing of air through this thing, so I'm going to have to recalibrate. Can you guys hear me? Is this good? Better? Oh, how about the... Big hit, like thumbs up from the boss in the back room. We're good to go. This story is called Bridge Number 27. Summer 1863, the summer of Gettysburg. On July 2nd, 1,200 Confederates attacked a hole in the Union lines at Cemetery Ridge. They were faced by 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Regiment, including Winona's own Company K. 262 men. How's that? 200 and... Okay, they could use me tonight at trivia. Anyone want to go in my place? Okay, the 1st Minnesota was ordered to charge, and charge they did. The 1st Minnesota took 82% casualties, held Cemetery Ridge, and the Union was saved. Meanwhile, back out by Lewiston, Minnesota, the Winona and St. Peter's Railroad's war on Stockton Hill was just warming up. The railroad had just reached Stockton by the back door through Minnesota City. But there was no back door leading from Stockton to Lewiston. The tracks had to climb 100 feet in 5 miles. A 4.0% gradient. That's mountain railroading. The railroad's only solution was cut and fill, dig some out, throw some dirt in, and all of that. But they weren't going to cut and fill their way up that hill to Lewiston, and that was a distinct problem. They were short on money, they were short on manpower because there was a civil war going on. The Winona in St. Peter was stopped 3 miles west of Stockton. The tracks are perched on a long bluffside that you all know well, overlooking Rolling Stone Creek, or whatever it is it's called these days. A huge gap was between them and Lewiston, 800 feet long and about 50 feet deep. The railroad put up a light wooden trestle called Bridge Number 27. Railroad building in the 1860s, especially during the Civil War, was you get it reasonably flat, you put some rails on it, ties if you got them, little gravel, let's go. I mean, it must have been terrifying to cross that thing. By 1883, though, Winona's own railroad was no longer Winona's own railroad. It was owned by the Chicago and Northwestern. The Chicago and Northwestern, though, had a lot of money. They decided to do something about Bridge Number 27. They would replace it with an 800-foot fill. What they did was they moved the hopper cars full of gravel and just dumped gravel off of the trestle constantly until they filled that whole thing up. All of those causeways you see there were actually, there's a trestle underneath that bridge there, a wooden trestle. It took a lot of gravel, so they had to set up a quarry in order to mill the stone for the bridge, to pound the gravel and stuff like that. And in season, the quarry operated, employed about 100 men, mostly East Enders, mostly day laborers who come in for $1 and do this all day. They would take a train from Winona in the morning, come back on the train in the evening. It was pretty dangerous work. I mean, Billy Chapievsky had a clay embankment just fall down on him it was Christmas Eve, for God's sake. They were working Christmas Eve because it was warm and the money was good, and the clay bank came down, and boom, that was the end of Billy Chapievsky. John Ostrowski got hit by a grain train, and Joseph Bambenek was thrown off a gravel car and then run over. Your ancestor, Jim. The founder of a family that has contributed, They're Baminiks. What more can you say? It was pretty easy to get killed working for the railroad. It still is. Nobody mourned the demise of Bridge Number 27, known as the Arches. It became a popular picnic location, and campers enjoyed it too. Even the fishing was great out at the Arches. Behind the scenes, Herbert C. Garvin was purchasing all the nearby property. In 1924, he donated the entire thing to the Winona County Farm Bureau. This was the beginning of Farmers Community Park, a beloved Winona County institution to this day. I've suggested elsewhere the story has some dark ends. Winona can have nice things today, thanks to the hard work of the everyday Winonans who came before us. I mean, Winona still celebrates its leaders, and visionaries, the Lairds, the Nortons, the Watkins, William Wyndham of the $2 bill fame, as well we should. But we must also consider the average Winonans, the average people of Winona County, the farmers, the storekeepers, the people who did the work every day. They provided the lawn, the brawn. They didn't expect life to be one big picnic out at the Arches. They came to Winona to work for a better life than the one they had, and they got it. Joseph Baminik's oldest son, Michael, was a policeman and the father of 15. His son Michael Jr. became director of Winona Parks. His son Ted operated Baminik's Groceries on Mankato Avenue for many years. His descendants live among us today. I could go on. I could go on and on and on. Just remember, though, life can be an ocean of cheerless pain. And you got two choices. You either tread water, or swim for it. The Baminiks swim for it. Thank you.
Now, Joe mentioned Company K and Cemetery Ridge. The Laird Norton clan lived about 100 miles north, just outside of Lewisburg. And so they were very much attuned to what was happening. None of their kids went to serve in the Civil War, mind you, but they were very aware of it. And that Laird Norton money built this library and all the old woodwork. Mr. Laird died in, I think 1912 or 1910. His partner, James Norton, died in 1906, and Matthew Norton, who I think had the most tragic life, died in 1917. All of their mansions are gone. James Norton's mansion is where the Lutheran Church is on Huff Street, 7th and Huff. That was once a huge mansion. Matthew Norton's home was where the old YMCA was. Is now a parking lot. That was Matthew Norton's home. Took up 3/4 of the block. It was huge. It was the biggest one in town. And William Laird was the direct benefactor of this. His house was on 4th Street. It's gone now. Just the other side of the Huff House. Joe talked about the donation of the land for Farmers Community Park. Mr. Garvin, who helped found Winona State, was also involved in the lumber industry and all sorts of businesses, lived at 6th and Broadway. No, it can't be 6th and Broadway. Huff and Broadway. There's a White House there on the corner. And he had the same problem there. I remember reading about him. They had these turnaround things in their garages so that they could drive headfirst out onto that intersection, because it still is a nasty intersection. You don't want to back out and then come, because people stop, they turn that corner. There's been a couple accidents there, some pretty serious accidents. And like I said, I'm getting better at forgetting some names. Gosh, names elude me. Anyway, I like walking through yesterday, And I love the Morgan Block. Morgan Block, for those of you who don't know, was where the mall, the downtown Winona Mall is now, and where the Senior High Rise Center. It used to be an entire block along with the Simpson Block along 3rd Street with 2 or 3-story brick buildings. And in its early days, it was a prosperous place. By the time I started coming of age where I started noticing things, it was in pretty rough shape. I mean, it years of not taking care of bricks and it all goes down. But it would look pretty cool down there now. But, and I, you know, if you've been into downtown Winona and you look at downtown Winona, there's a lot of money being spent. I mean, Merchants Bank, other banks, Winona National Bank, there's a lot of work going on in the upstairs buildings. People are moving to Winona. Our little haven, our little secret, is being invaded by outsiders. I got no problem. I got no problem with that, but people are coming to Winona because of the quality of the life. 5 minutes, you can find peace and quiet on the other side of the river. 5 minutes, you can get up by St. Mary's and get in the back hills. You don't hear nothing. And there are so many activities. Older people are coming to Winona, left and right, because they feel safe. So the Morgan Block was the heart and soul of Winona. That's where people from the East End and the West End would gather. 40s, 50s, 30s, 20s. They'd pound their drinks. They'd have their morning breakfast. They'd drink their coffee. Downtown Winona was hopping. I mean, this was a small town quite unlike any other. We had lumber money. We had railroad money. We had Bay State Milling money. Those are big companies for a little bitty town. We had Peerless Chain. And the one thing we have Fastenal now, you want to know what the one thing that makes Winona go as far as business goes? Winonans are the most resourceful SOBs I've ever come across. We don't waste nothing. When you look at those millers down there, they made a business out of waste. Like not Jerry. Well, Jerry did all right in the waste business too. But Hugh, and before him his dad Ben, and before him his dad Joe, nobody wasted money, even if they had it. In fact, sometimes if they had it, they became even cheaper. But they invested in quality, and they knew they invested in those big churches, and they knew the schools. They invested in schools. They built all these new schools that ain't so new anymore, Madison Central, WK, Jefferson, during the Depression. I mean, what's that say about Winona? Anyway, I was walking through the Morgan Block. And the Morgan Block was a home of characters. Guys like Chinky Durman and Johnny Lavelle and all the characters hung around the Morgan Block, especially in his later days because the rent was cheaper, you know. So I walk through that Morgan Block and I could still feel the dead. I could still feel the dead spirits there. I mean, there ain't no dead folk out in the suburbs. It's right here in downtown Winona. It's magical. It's magical. I found myself wandering Morgan's Block when the dead from that area found me. It goes dark. First guy I saw was as wide as he was tall. His arms and face, fingers, and the old Y boys tell me his privates were just the same. Nothing but hair. Yeah. Mr. Dearman, Stanley Dearman, you are looking fine. I reached out my hand and nodded my head. Do I know you? No. Merle Hanson, you are the stuff of legends. You've been gone how long? Good 20 years. Yep. You know, this side is a bit different. People talk good of you, Stan. They got a smile on their face. He shook his head. They used to stare, look away. You think I like that hair all over my body? Huh? Only girl who ever talked to me normal, relaxed was Mrs. Pop, Frankie, and Dan, Joe, and the list goes on. Their mama was special. Some of the boys gave me a hard time, but they never got too close when they were talking. Pomeroy? Come on, Stanley. Another of the old boys put in his 2 cents. Tell him about Mrs. Pomeroy. It was all you ever talked about when living. Never let anyone near her. She was your queen. You followed her around like a puppy dog, Stanley. I'd do it again. Mind your own business, Dickman. And on my mother's grave, don't you ever say a disparaging word about Mrs. Pomeroy again. I'll break you in 2. Words can't begin to express my deep love for the incomparable Mrs. P. Then he looked at me and whispered, that's Dickman. He's married to the hag next apartment over. Him and I don't see eye to eye on nothing. He then raised his voice so Dickman could hear. Dickman! Envy! It's one of the 7 deadly sins. Ah, shut the hell up. What's a heathen know? God is Catholic. Methodist, you 2 pea-brains, the man from across the way yelled. It ain't neither, the old hag said. It's Judaism. Hey, sociology boy. Yeah, you long-haired, bearded, wire-rimmed one. What world are you living in today, boy? What is your thinking on the subject? He stood up. Well, Stanley, Debbie, Max, and Patsy. I think the concept of God is far more abstract. All youth nowadays got to use the big words. Make yourself feel smarter. It took 1 year to build that bridge in 1941. That was before computers. And during the war, too. How fast can you build them nowadays? Stanley yelled. That old bridge speaks Winona. They built it during the Second World War. I like that bridge and the one that is halfway tore down next to it. That was the town I knew and felt most at home in. Everybody knew me, Stanley Dearman. They had a nickname for me. They called me Chinky. The student rode on, unwilling to let the subject drop. What do you suppose the Japanese see as being their ultimate being? What does their God look like? Debbie, he asked. Damn kid is right, another voice chimed in. My roots go back to old Ireland before St. Patrick showed up. All my forefathers ended up over here. Didn't need no Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Jew, or Muslim. Buddhist, even the outlaws found peace. Patrick Finnegan, your brain is pickled. You make no sense. I've a mind to pop you one in the kisser. Would you all just shut up? The woman on another stoop waved her hands like she'd chew them all away. It is the bottom of the 7th, and sand is hitting his spots. Oh, Mrs. Clute, we are sorry. Got the arguing disease in our bones. You let go of that anger or you end up like Miss Patsy. She was my grandmother's figure, you see. She treated me with kindness almost like my mama. Mama never looked away, Mrs. Clute just the first time. She would bake bread, no smell quite like the bread of the Morgan Street Bakery. Men would stop on their way home from the mills and factories. She sent extra bread to Walt Newman, so he could feed the boys whose life had been turned upside down. This was my town. People without much caring for people with less. Mama raised me right, you see. Early on, she could see. Early on, that I wasn't quite right. The old uncles used to laugh that I was born with a beard and Mama worried, you see. Uncle Herman, he was the family secret. He killed a man who struck a woman in the old country. Spent most of his life in chains, locked up. Hair like a caveman and strong beyond strong. He had a hard time talking or reading, wasn't something he did. Worrying that might befall me kept my mama from happiness. There weren't many better places than the Morgan block. Maybe it was the way the light filtered through the buildings or the feelings of life remaining and echoing through its walls. Winona's heart and soul. And then I got a little short snippet here before I turn it back over to Joe. Kept walking through the Morgan block, and there's people hanging up on those stoops upstairs in the back in the shade, just relaxing. The nighthawks would be swooping down. You could hear them in Winona. We don't hear them no more. Nighthawks are all gone. Well, I don't. Maybe you do, but I don't hear none of those nighthawks anymore downtown. They used to come. No, I think they're gone. Yeah. Yeah, they come down and you'd hear them swoop. It'd scare you if you were drinking too much or if you're smoking some of that dope back in the day, you know. You're kind of paranoid. Anyway, I'm going out, and this lady says, Hanson, come here, I got a note for you to read. Just read it. Just read it. You don't have to talk to me. I want to give you an idea of what's going through me. It was dated June 30th, 1863. Dear Anna, this I'm afraid will be my last letter. I'm here at a place called Gettysburg. The air is filled with gloom. The houses, businesses, bars, and churches are all shuttered. The storm of war is just beyond the horizon. I hear death calling, Anna. I pray I survive, but God is whispering that my time is ended. A town of womenfolk and old men, grandpas and grandmas, all alone as their kin are fighting down south. Death, that's death calling. Lee and the South are just a ridge away. Gettysburg will be a massacre that people will talk about forever. May our spirits meet again. Love, Jeb. She was a cool lady.
Thank you very much, Bo. It's out, down, not messing with it. This one's called The Death of Lena Weinberg. Lena Weinberg's death was quickly hushed up. By the 4th of July, Winonans were back to their summer 1899 pastime, watching the Huff House quartered and dragged off in the name of progress, watching all the new buildings go up, the new federal post office, the new Winona County Courthouse, the new Winona Hotel, coming in 1890. The 1880s had been good to Winona. The 1890s were going to be even better. Everybody said so. The big money boys thought the 1890s would be even better. Lamberton, Norton, Laird, Hamilton, and V. Simpson, known as Verragano, horsewhipped his wife down Lafayette Street in 1870, defrauded, sued by his brother for defrauding their elderly father who was in his 90s. That was V. Simpson. I digress.
Winona, I'm sorry.
Yeah. It gets worse, buddy. Listen up. They were all cheerfully pitching tens of thousands of dollars down the road to nowhere, otherwise known as the Winona and Southwestern Railroad. You drive on the guts of the Winona and Southwestern Railroad every time you drive 14/61. There used to be a railroad there. Should never have built it. They were right in that Winona was being choked off by the Burlington, the Milwaukee Road, and the Chicago and Northwestern. They got it into their heads to build this railroad southwest out of Winona. They were aiming for Omaha. it got as far as Osage, Iowa. Any of you ever been to Osage, Iowa? We've all had reasonably decent lives. But anyway, Winona, John R. Beam believed that Winona in Southwestern was going nowhere. Every railroader in town knew this. The Milwaukee, the Burlington, the Northwestern they own 90% of Winona's rail traffic, and they weren't sharing with anybody. All run for the benefit of Chicago businesses. Winona needed another railroad, and the big money boys thought that the Winona and Southwestern would be the ticket. Here's for Omaha. Bottom line was, when they finally sold that, Ms. Verrazano Simpson was the last owner of that railroad. He sold it off for 16 cents on the dollar and considered a good deal. John R. Beam thought it was a mistake to draw and quarter the Huff House. This is where it gets visceral. Disrespectful even. When it was built in 1856, it was the talk of the upper Mississippi. The Huff House put the Winona on the map of civilization. It survived the Great Fire of 1862. It was undersized by 1889 standards, and it was getting a little run down, but the energy that kept Winona going was still housed in the Huff House, and they cut it into quarters. That's how the kings of England used to punish high treason back in the 1300s. It's the same feeling I get. What the hell? When I look out the window, you could look out literally that window. Something is happening. Okay? They bought out the BP store over there that the owner said she was never going to sell out. Well, guess what? She sold out. They waved enough money at her and she sold out. And as you look at the houses going down on the street, is that 3rd Street, Merle? I always have to check with counties before I give directions. But you see the house is going down, and then the houses that people are living in. Is there some sort of plan for 4th Street? Who's got all the... Well, we all know who's got the money. It was the same thing in Winona in 1889. And boy, were they about to find out. He could tell something wasn't right. He walked the streets talking to practically everybody, but nobody knew who it was. The old settlers and old capitalists who had made Winona what it was were being run off the face of the earth. Henry Huff, who had built the hotel in the first place, basically moved off to Chicago, lost everything in the fire. Nobody felt sad about Henry Huff. As well, somebody that I won't name who works at the Historical Society said he was a prick. But there was also, go ahead.
You know, I don't know if you lose where Henry Huff's house was. Still standing. It's a
Mm-hmm.
I got that tower,
Yep.
and it was alleged his wife was mad and locked in that tower. The sounds of quiet Winona back in the day. 3-2 bluffs in the river. You could hear her. Oh. Oh. Okay. So Henry Huff stuck his soon-to-be ex-wife up in that tower. Now Henry Huff, he was not a nice man. He got in gunfights, Sanborn, and I forget another guy taking shots, Silsby taking shots at some of the early founders. And the little prick, of course, he had a cane. You know, he was just a small, diminutive kind of guy. He had a cane, and he walked, and they got a picture of his handwriting up in the Historical Society. And it's that Palmer method, all dainty. And it would take me a week to write like that. But he was mean. He foreclosed on people. He was the government agent, the land agent. In fact, when he came back after dying in Chicago in, well, like 1890, something like that, he came back. And even though he was a founder of the Masonic Temple, nobody knew him. Nobody knew Henry Huff anymore. People threatened to throw him to the catfish, but he had bodyguards. Nobody liked Henry Huff. Now, I got one story left, and then you can all ask questions. Are you done?
No.
Well, I got on a roll. You know, those dead people start talking.
You might as well finish it off. Go for it.
You want me to?
Absolutely. 100%.
I'm a bad partner. Well, my life has mostly been a set of screw-ups anyway, so.
Hey, I'm wrong about it all the time.
Now, a lot of times, people who show up, I end up putting them in stories. The next, time I sit down, probably tomorrow morning, I might write about this event tonight, because there's a lot of people in here, I got that problem. There's a lot of people in here who most people can't see, but some of us got a few issues, So anyway, this is the story of one of my first book readings. I did it down at the Blue Heron downtown. I was kind of nerved up, and so, but I did okay. Took me a little while to get on a roll. Had a couple of people crying that night. Told a Gettysburg story or something else, and they're welling up, but that happens. They were all there for my book reading, proud like handsome men tend to be. They all had their canes and sat near the back of the bookstore across a long bench. They were filled with pride as I started my talking. These are the dead faces of my Republican roots. They fought for their country and farmed their land. None of them had ever written a book, and a man expressing his opinion was at the heart of their America. These folks carried that flag of honor as they went through their day. A book that questioned their way of thinking was at their heart of a better America. They were never afraid to argue and be now they can't talk. I wonder how they resolved their differences. I nodded my head as they found their seat. I could feel the energy of them being there and of seeing them. They asked for milk from the dead waitress. I could tell by their eyes it was time for the show. I sent a note to them thanking them for being. It is not every day dead people show up for a book reading. Not every day. They, like the rest of the folks, were watching and waiting for the talk to begin. I mumbled some words and got a bit off track. My spotters gestured and I found my pace. I read stories of dead people, old priests who might have been, and dreams crushed on the fields of death. Pretty horrific except for some of the other dead folks who showed. They were happy to be remembered and thought maybe there was still hope for us if we remembered our history. I felt good when the talking stopped. That night wound down and we all said goodbye, living and dead. Old Grandpa Hoagie stood just outside the door. His long white hair stood in contrast to the dark sky overhead, and I could hear him saying to keep on writing, knock down some walls of ignorance. He said if I got too high in the britches, him and his grandsons would put me in my place. I heard Harry Chapin singing Cat's Cradle, and as I turned, they were gone. Now, I'm sorry, Joe.
Any questions?
Oh, you're such a quiet group.